Rick Crusher Dalton was the kind of man who thrived on intimidation. A hulking figure clad in a weathered leather jacket, his thick beard and ever-present smirk gave him the look of someone who had seen too many bar fights and walked away grinning. He led his biker gang, the Iron Fangs, with an iron fist, always seeking new ways to prove their dominance. For Rick, toughness wasn't just a trait, it was a performance, and every town they rode into was his stage. That day, their roaring motorcycles tore through Ridgewood, a quiet, sun-soaked town nestled between rolling hills. It was the kind of place where folks left their doors unlocked, where kids rode their bikes without worry. But as Rick and his gang rumbled down Main Street, the air changed. Conversations hushed. Shopkeepers averted their eyes. Families sitting outside the local Rusty Spoon Cafe stiffened at the sight of the gang's arrival. Rick reveled in the tension. This was exactly what he wanted: power over people, without throwing a single punch. He strutted toward the cafe, his boots thudding against the pavement like a drumbeat of impending trouble. His gang followed, laughing loudly, their leather jackets glistening under the midday sun. Then something caught Rick's attention. Two dogs sitting obediently near the cafe entrance, their fur gleaming in the sunlight. He smirked. Well, well, what do we have here? He muttered, setting the stage for what would become the biggest mistake of his life. Rick's smirk widened as he eyed the two dogs sitting near the cafe entrance. One was a golden retriever, its soft, honey-colored fur gleaming in the afternoon light, its gentle eyes watching the world with curiosity. The other was a black and tan Doberman, poised and alert, radiating strength. Both sat obediently, well-trained, and completely unaware that trouble was brewing. Rick nudged one of his gang members with his elbow. "Look at these spoiled mutts," he chuckled, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. His voice dripped with amusement, but his mind was already working, searching for a way to entertain himself at the expense of the helpless. That's what he did best. Without a second thought, Rick lifted his heavy boot and kicked the golden retriever's side. Not hard enough to injure, but just enough to send it stumbling back with a startled yelp. The Doberman shot up instantly, muscles tensed, eyes locked onto Rick with laser focus. For a split second, the air was electric. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then came the reactions. A woman gasped, dropping her coffee, the cup shattering against the pavement. A child gripping an ice cream cone squeezed it so hard that the scoop plopped onto the ground, forgotten. A waiter, frozen mid-step, barely breathed as he watched. The entire cafe patio fell into dead silence, the only sound being the soft whimper of the golden retriever, trying to understand why it had been attacked. And Rick? Rick laughed. "Relax, people. It's just a dog," he scoffed, hands spread as if mocking their concern. Some of his gang members chuckled hesitantly, but even they could feel the shift in the air. Because what Rick didn't know, what nobody in his gang realized, was that these weren't just any dogs. They belonged to Mike Tyson. And Mike had been watching. From inside the cafe, a man slowly lowered his cup of tea, his strong fingers curling around the handle as his sharp eyes locked onto the scene outside. The golden retriever was his dog. The Doberman was his protector. And Rick? Rick had just stepped into a ring he wasn't ready for. The cafe owner, a kind-faced older man, turned ghostly pale. His eyes darted from the dogs to the massive figure sitting by the window. He took a hesitant step closer and whispered, "Sir, I think that biker just made the worst mistake of his life." But Mike Tyson didn't need to be told. He already knew. With slow, deliberate movements, he placed his teacup back onto the saucer. The sound, a soft, almost delicate clink, might as well have been the ringing of a fight bell. The tension was unbearable. Every single person inside the cafe was holding their breath. Some stole nervous glances at the door, anticipating what was about to happen. And then he stood up. Mike Tyson didn't need to yell. He didn't need to rush. His mere presence was enough to change everything. As he stepped toward the cafe door, the tension outside shifted. People instinctively moved back. Some grabbed their drinks and slipped away, while others stayed frozen in place, their eyes glued to the scene about to unfold. Meanwhile, outside, Rick was still laughing, completely oblivious to the storm heading his way. And if you're still watching, you don't want to miss what happens next. What do you think will happen when Mike Tyson walks out that door? Comment below your guess. Will Rick apologize? Will his gang step in? Or is this about to be the biggest beatdown of his life? If you love stories about justice being served, hit like and subscribe for the next part. And if you think Rick is about to regret every decision he's ever made, drop a fire in the comments. Stay tuned because things are about to get very interesting. Rick's breath came in short, ragged gasps. His chest still burned from the last hit. His knees felt weak, and for the first time in a long time, he was truly afraid. This wasn't like any bar fight he'd been in before. This wasn't a fight at all. It was a lesson, and Mike Tyson was the teacher. His gang, the same men who once cheered him on, stood frozen. No one dared to step forward. They had arrived in Ridgewood expecting an easy ride, maybe some cheap laughs at the expense of a few townsfolk. But now? Now they just wanted to disappear. Rick wiped his mouth, his pride screaming at him to do something, anything, to salvage what little reputation he had left. He had been humiliated, knocked down twice, disarmed in seconds, and now he stood there, stripped of the aura of invincibility he had once carried. And then, the moment that changed everything. Rick reached into his pocket. His fingers curled around the smooth handle of a switchblade. It was small but sharp, his last card to play. The moment the blade flicked open, the reaction was instant. A gasp rippled through the crowd. The townsfolk stepped back, some clutching their mouths in shock. A few people whispered urgently, their voices barely above a breath. But Mike? Mike didn't flinch. If anything, he sighed. A quiet, almost disappointed exhale. You really don't know when to quit, do you? His voice was calm, almost conversational. But there was an edge beneath it, something sharp enough to cut deeper than any blade Rick could pull. Rick gritted his teeth. He couldn't back down now. Not after everything. With a growl, he lunged forward. The blade sliced through the air, fast, reckless. Rick had put everything he had left into that strike. It didn't matter. Mike moved before the knife even got close. A simple shift of weight, a precise movement of his arm. In less than a second, he caught Rick's wrist mid-swing, and then he twisted. Rick let out a strangled grunt as pain shot through his arm. His fingers gave out, the knife clattering to the pavement below. His knees buckled. His body, once filled with cocky confidence, now trembled under Mike's grip. Mike leaned in, his voice low, steady, and final. That's how it feels to be helpless, he said. His grip tightened slightly before releasing Rick's wrist. Now imagine how my dog felt. Rick didn't say a word. He couldn't. The weight of those words settled over him like a coffin lid. He staggered back, clutching his wrist, his breathing shallow and uneven. His gang remained where they were, silent. They knew better than to challenge what had just happened. One by one, they took small, hesitant steps backward. Rick swallowed hard. His face burned, not from pain, but from shame. He had lost, and not just the fight. He had lost everything. His reputation, his gang's respect, his illusion of dominance. There was nothing left to do but walk away. With a final glance at Mike, who still stood there, composed, unmoved, Rick turned, slowly stepping toward his bike. His gang followed, but not as brothers in arms. They followed because they no longer saw him as a leader. The silence in Ridgewood was deafening as the engines roared to life. No one cheered, no one jeered. They simply watched. As the gang rode off, their once powerful presence reduced to nothing more than retreating echoes. The tension in the air lifted. Mike stood there for a moment, his eyes on the empty road. Then, without a word, he turned back toward the cafe. His golden retriever trotted up beside him, pressing against his leg in quiet reassurance. Mike knelt down, running his hand through the dog's fur. The retriever wagged its tail, no longer afraid. The battle was over, and justice had been served. Rick's body tensed as he lay on the pavement, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts. His ears rang, his chest ached, and the worst part, his gang was still watching. Not just his gang, the entire town. A few minutes ago, he had strutted through Ridgewood like he owned the place. Now, he was on his back, gasping for air, looking up at the man who had just dismantled him like it was nothing. Mike Tyson didn't gloat. He didn't even look angry. That's what made it worse. There was no satisfaction in his face, no smugness, just calm, controlled dominance. Rick scrambled to his feet, nearly tripping over himself in the process. His pride was shattered, but his instincts were still screaming at him. Do something. Fight back. Don't let them see you weak. His jaw clenched, and without thinking, he lunged. It was sloppy, desperate. His body was still recovering from the impact, but his ego refused to let him stop. Mike didn't even move at first. He simply watched. Then, at the last possible second, he stepped aside. Rick stumbled forward, his momentum carrying him past Mike and into a wooden cafe table. The impact sent plates and cups flying, coffee spilling onto the ground as Rick crashed into the wreckage. A sharp gasp echoed through the crowd. Some townsfolk even laughed quietly, unable to hide their amusement. Rick pushed himself up, his hands shaking with rage and humiliation. His knuckles turned white as he clenched his fists. This couldn't be happening. He spun around, teeth bared. "You think you're funny?" he snarled. His voice was raw, desperate. Mike finally spoke. "No." The single word cut through Rick like a knife. Before Rick could react, Mike stepped in. It was fast, too fast. A blur of controlled motion. Mike's hand shot forward, striking Rick square in the chest. Not hard enough to cause real injury, but precise enough to knock the wind out of him. Rick's eyes widened. His breath left him in a painful gasp, his body staggering backward. His legs felt like jelly. Mike took another slow step forward. Rick, for the first time in his life, stepped back. His instincts screamed at him to run. The people of Ridgewood saw it. His gang saw it. Rick Crusher Dalton, the self-proclaimed toughest man in the room, was afraid. Mike didn't press further. He didn't have to. The message had already been delivered. Rick had lost. Completely. And everyone knew it. Rick's pride was in shambles. His chest still burned from the precise strike. His legs felt unsteady. And worst of all, his gang was watching. The same men who once followed him without question were now silent, unsure, maybe even embarrassed. But Rick wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. The humiliation was too much to bear. The town, the cafe, even the old man wiping his hands on an apron, they were all watching. The smirks, the whispered words, the knowing looks. It was unbearable. His hands trembled with frustration. He had to do something. Anything. And then, he made his final mistake. His fingers slipped into his pocket, closing around the smooth handle of a switchblade. It was small, but sharp. His last chance to regain control. A hush fell over the town. People gasped. A woman covered her child's eyes. The gang members shifted uneasily. "Mike?" He didn't even blink. Instead, he sighed. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" His voice was calm, almost tired. Rick didn't hesitate. He lunged, the blade flashing toward Mike's side. It never got there. Mike moved so fast, it was almost impossible to see. His hand shot forward, snatching Rick's wrist in a vice-like grip. Before Rick could even react, his entire arm was twisted, his muscles screaming in pain. The knife clattered to the ground. Rick let out a sharp grunt, his knees buckling under the sudden, crushing pressure. Mike leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper, but every single person in Ridgewood could hear him. "That's how it feels to be helpless." Rick froze. The words hit harder than any punch could. Mike's grip tightened for just a second longer, ensuring Rick understood. Then, just as effortlessly as he had taken control, he let go. Rick stumbled back, his wrist throbbing, his mind spinning, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing left. The crowd was silent. His gang, the men who had always had his back, looked away. Rick had never felt this alone. He swallowed hard. His body screamed at him to fight, but his mind knew it was over. His hands curled into fists, but he didn't raise them. Instead, he took a step back, and then another. The reality hit him like a freight train. Mike had beaten him without even breaking a sweat. Rick had never lost like this before. Not just physically, he had been dismantled. His gang saw it. The entire town saw it. There was no coming back from this. His voice, usually loud and confident, was barely a whisper now. Let's go. He didn't look at anyone. Not his gang, not Mike. The bikers hesitated, waiting for someone to say something. But when Rick didn't turn back, when he didn't challenge Mike again, they knew. One by one, they followed. As the sound of motorcycles roaring to life echoed through Ridgewood, the townspeople watched in awe. Mike Tyson had just taken down a gang of outlaws, without throwing a single punch in anger. And now? Rick was leaving town in disgrace. But here's the real question. What happens next? Will Rick seek revenge? Will his gang turn on him? Or is this the last time Ridgewood will ever see the Iron Fangs? Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you think Rick is finished. Or if you think he'll be back for more. And if you haven't already, hit that like button and subscribe for part 2. Because trust me, this story isn't over yet. The roar of the motorcycles faded into the distance, swallowed by the quiet streets of Ridgewood. The air, once thick with tension, now felt lighter, as if the entire town had exhaled all at once. Mike Tyson stood in the same spot, watching until the last biker disappeared over the horizon. His expression never changed. Calm, unshaken, absolute. The townspeople slowly began to move again. A few murmured among themselves, their voices hushed as if still processing what they had just witnessed. The cafe owner, who had been gripping his apron so tightly his knuckles had turned white, finally let go, shaking his head in disbelief. One by one, people turned to look at Mike, not with fear, but with respect. He hadn't just defended his dogs. He had defended them. Ridgewood was a quiet place, a town where trouble rarely came knocking. But when it did, most people knew better than to fight back. That was just how the world worked. Until today. A small boy no older than 8 broke from his mother's grasp. He ran up to the golden retriever and gently patted its fur. The dog, once shaken, now wagged its tail, leaning into the boy's touch. "Is he okay?" the boy asked, glancing up at Mike with wide, curious eyes. Mike crouched down, rubbing the retriever's ear. "Yeah," he said softly, "he's okay." The boy smiled, and something in the town seemed to shift. The weight of the moment, the fear, the tension, it all began to fade. Behind him, the cafe owner chuckled, stepping forward. "Well," he said, wiping his hands on his apron, "that was quite a show." Mike gave a small nod. He wasn't looking for praise. He never had been. The elderly shopkeeper, a woman with silver hair and wise eyes, approached next. "I don't think they'll be coming back any time soon," she mused. "And if they do," she glanced at Mike with a knowing smile. "Well, let's just say, I doubt they'll be in the mood to cause trouble." The crowd laughed, a real, genuine laugh that released the last of the tension. Mike Tyson had come to Ridgewood for a quiet afternoon, nothing more. But fate had other plans. Now, his presence was something of a legend. A few feet away, the knife Rick had pulled still lay on the ground, glinting in the sunlight. A reminder of what could have been, a reminder of what didn't need to happen. Mike glanced at it once. Then, without a word, he turned back toward the cafe. His dogs followed him, step for step. And just like that, the moment was over. But Ridgewood would never forget it. The aftermath days passed, and Ridgewood slowly returned to normal. The small-town rhythm resumed. Shopkeepers opened their stores. Families enjoyed their daily strolls, and the cafe remained the heart of it all. But there was one difference. People still talked about what had happened that day. Mike Tyson's quiet but undeniable presence had left its mark on the town. The story spread like wildfire, how a gang of outlaws had roared into Ridgewood, looking to stir up trouble, how their leader, Rick Crusher Dalton, had made the mistake of kicking the wrong man's dog, and how, without throwing a single punch in anger, Mike had shattered the gang's illusion of power. Some retold it with awe, marveling at Mike's sheer skill and discipline. Others spoke of justice, relieved that someone had finally stood up to men like Rick. And a few, mostly the older folk who had seen their fair share of trouble, simply nodded and smiled, as if they had always known that men like Mike were built differently. The cafe owner, Hank, had become something of a storyteller, recounting the scene to anyone who asked. I tell you, he said one afternoon, shaking his head as he wiped down a table, never seen a man move like that. One second, that biker thought he was on top of the world, and the next, flat on his back, staring up at the sky. The old woman from the shop across the street chuckled, pouring herself another cup of coffee. The way he stood there, so calm. You'd think he wasn't even fazed, she mused. That's real power, not in the fists, but in the mind. Even the little boy who had patted Mike's golden retriever had turned into something of a celebrity among his friends. He acted out the moment with excitement, mimicking Mike's movements as best as a child could. And then, boom, he said, pretending to dodge an invisible punch. That biker guy didn't even know what hit him. Meanwhile, Rick and his gang had vanished. Nobody had seen them since that day. The Iron Fangs, once loud and reckless, had left Ridgewood without so much as a word. No one knew where they had gone, and no one cared to find out. But Ridgewood had learned something important. Not all men who walked softly were weak, and not all troublemakers were unstoppable. One afternoon, a lone motorcycle rumbled down Main Street. A few people tensed, their eyes flicking toward the road. But it wasn't Rick, and it wasn't his gang. Just a traveler, passing through. Hank, watching from behind the cafe counter, smiled to himself. Things had changed.